Hello everyone, welcome to the Tim Booker channel. I hope you enjoy listening to books. Today, I'll be talking about a book by the renowned American diplomat Henry A. Kissinger titled, A World Restored. This book spans over 400 pages and is densely annotated. Its subtitle is Metternich, Castlereagh and the Problems of Peace, 1812-22. Metternich was the Austrian foreign minister in the early 19th century, while Castlereagh served as the British foreign minister at the time. From this, it's evident that this is a work delving into diplomatic history. It's worth noting that Kissinger didn't write this book solely out of personal interest. A World Restored was actually his doctoral dissertation at Harvard University, completed in 1954. This was an unconventional choice considering the world context of 1954, with the intense Cold War between the US and USSR overshadowing much of the globe. For a political science PhD, especially one focused on international politics, delving into these contemporary issues would typically yield academic recognition. However, Kissinger spent a remarkable 4 years studying historical events of the 19th century. Boldly, he asserted finding the ultimate principles ensuring world peace within that history, principles termed as balance of power and legitimacy. Kissinger believed that these ultimate principles he derived would be more beneficial in analyzing the Cold War between the US and USSR compared to examining specific policies. Surprisingly, Harvard University highly regarded this untimely dissertation, awarding Kissinger the best political science dissertation of 1954. Notably, Kissinger's mentors weren't ordinary professors. His doctoral advisor was Eliot, who served as a political advisor to 6 U.S. presidents. Among the professors on his defense committee was George Bundy, who later became President Kennedy's national security advisor. The accolades from such scholars who had practical political experience signify that A World Restored indeed offered substantial insights. Remarkably, 15 years after completing A World Restored, Kissinger entered the U.S. government, directly engaging in formulating diplomatic policies. His diplomatic artistry closely aligned with the ultimate principles he had distilled in his original thesis. The renowned American political scientist Fukuyama opined that Kissinger's pursuit of foreign policy shares many commonalities with the overall principles of European diplomacy mentioned in A World Restored. After studying this book, you'll gain an entire set of Kissinger's diplomatic essence. You'll understand what decisive factors, in Kissinger's view, influence relations between major powers and how world peace is maintained. These insights will significantly aid in comprehending the current global scenario. Henry A. Kissinger, the author of this book, is renowned as a contemporary diplomatic master and a friend to many nations. During Nixon's presidency, Kissinger served as National Security Advisor and Secretary of State, playing a crucial role in normalizing relations between countries like China and the U.S. In May 2023, the long-lived Kissinger is set to celebrate his 100th birthday. However, what might be less known is that Kissinger is also an outstanding historian and writer. His work, A World Restored, is remarkably eloquent. Kissinger's vivid commentaries on historical figures like Napoleon and Metternich within the book will undoubtedly make you exclaim, "I didn't know a doctoral dissertation could be written this way." Next, I'll break down the main content and distinctive viewpoints presented in this book into 3 parts. 1. Understanding why Kissinger regards the balance of power and legitimacy as the ultimate principles for maintaining long-term peace. 2. Exploring how Metternich and Castlereagh, the 2 19th-century diplomats, practiced these principles. 3. Summarizing a series of diplomatic essences Kissinger distilled in this book and how they help us understand today's international politics and offer insights into our daily lives. Firstly, let's delve into the 2 ultimate principles for maintaining peace proposed by Kissinger, balance of power and legitimacy. To address this, we must revisit the overarching theme of this book, A World Restored. Restoration implies a recent experience of significant destruction, upheaving the world entirely. In early 19th century Europe, this devastation stemmed from the Napoleonic Wars. Napoleon, a military genius rising amidst the French Revolution, commanded a powerful revolutionary army, repelling invasions from the anti-French coalition, safeguarding the achievements of the revolution. By 1803, Napoleon effectively ruled France and later declared himself emperor, expanding his political ambitions beyond protecting France's territorial integrity. He aimed to expand outward, conquering the entirety of Europe. Between 1803 and 1815, France under Napoleon engaged in comprehensive warfare with over 20 European countries, resulting in a loss of over 4 million lives. Considering Europe's population barely surpassed 200 million at that time, 4 million equated to 2% of the total population, signifying a staggering loss of life, approximately 1 death among every 50 individuals. Despite his remarkable victories and immense destruction, Napoleon eventually faced defeat. The famous Battle of Waterloo in 1815 saw his complete downfall at the hands of a coalition comprising much of Europe. You might ask, why couldn't Napoleon, after his conquests akin to ancient China's unification by Qin, establish a stable political order post-initial military triumphs? To address this query, Kissinger revisited the birth of modern European nations. After the end of the Middle Ages, Europe witnessed aspirations for a unified entity. However, in the 17th century, fierce conflicts erupted between the Catholic and Protestant factions known as the 30 Years' War. No side gained a decisive advantage, leading to the signing of the Peace of Westphalia. This treaty established two fundamental principles of international law: sovereign equality and national supremacy. Sovereign equality is self-explanatory, while national supremacy implies that a country's government possesses absolute authority over internal matters within its territory, immune to external influences, whether from the Church or foreign monarchs. Following the enforcement of the Peace of Westphalia, European countries gradually adopted a basic set of norms for diplomatic activities. Although occasional wars erupted, sovereign equality and national supremacy became consensus principles. However, Napoleon diverged from these norms, directly subverting all traditional rules and expansively asserting France's dominance. He appointed his brothers as kings of Holland and Spain, establishing pro-French new kingdoms in German territories, actions completely contradictory to the principle of national supremacy. Worse still, while dismantling old rules, Napoleon failed to establish new ones. He inconsistently expressed support for Poland's independence while aggressively occupying Switzerland, traditionally friendly to France. Kissinger concludes that attempting European unification under a capricious leader like Napoleon was inherently unfeasible. Furthermore, Napoleon's reliance on military might was a crucial reason why French hegemony couldn't be sustained long-term. In the opening chapters of A World Restored, Kissinger recounts an incident. In 1812, with an army of 700,000, Napoleon invaded Russia. Tolstoy's novel, War and Peace, narrates this conflict. Prior to 1812, Russia and France were allies. However, to strangle his archenemy Britain, Napoleon prohibited trade between Russia and England, severely impacting Russia's export-dependent economy. Russia immediately rejected this demand. If Napoleon were a shrewd politician, he could have proposed France providing financial subsidies to compensate Russia's losses. However, Napoleon's sole effective political tool was the military. If Russia disagreed, then war it had to be. Consequently, within half a year, Napoleon's expeditionary force faced defeat and hastily retreated from Russia. Subsequently, European nations that once succumbed to French might initiated a new war of revenge, signaling the decline of the Napoleonic Empire. From the defeat in Russia in 1812 to the Battle of Waterloo in 1815, France began its downward trajectory, yet the issue of European peace remained unresolved. Kissinger observed that Russia played a pivotal role in the final phase of the anti-French war. In 1815, Russia boasted a colossal army of 800,000, exceeding the combined forces of Britain, Austria, and Prussia. Tsar Alexander I of Russia, after Napoleon's defeat, rode into Paris on a white horse, presenting himself as Europe's savior. Given this scenario, would Russia emulate France's precedent, attempting to establish a new hegemony through military means? Even if Russia didn't entertain such thoughts, would defeated France, after a few years' respite, resume the path of revenge through force? Both these questions posed significant challenges. In addressing these questions, Kissinger unveils his primary diplomatic doctrine. The two protagonists in A World Restored, Metternich and Castlereagh, also highly advocate this doctrine, known as the balance of power or balance of power. Essentially, it means preventing any nation in the international community from becoming powerful enough to destroy other nations through force. If any inkling of such hegemony arises, other powers must swiftly unite, form political and military alliances, and counterbalance or even besiege the hegemonic nation. You might not find this surprising. Isn't it akin to the art of war? How does it become a diplomatic doctrine? Hold on, Kissinger explains. In A World Restored, he proposes a revolutionary viewpoint. As long as a country exists in the international community and aims to interact peacefully with others, it must endure a certain level of insecurity and never anticipate the elimination of all external threats. This might seem abstract, so here's an example. In the 19th century, Britain possessed the most substantial financial strength in Europe and the most powerful navy worldwide. Yet, most continental European countries didn't resent or see Britain as an intolerable hegemon. Why? Because Britain had an apparent power deficiency, its army was small and lacked aggression. Relying solely on the navy meant Britain couldn't launch an invasion into the continental mainland. Note, Britain could afford a larger army. In the midst of the Napoleonic Wars, when Britain faced isolation, its army expanded rapidly. However, most of the time, Britain chose to actively retain this flaw to exchange goodwill among European continental countries. Since continental powers weren't concerned about direct British invasions, they naturally didn't feel the need to counterbalance Britain. Conversely, France's approach was the typical opposite case. In the late 18th century, France propagated a concept termed natural boundaries. It suggested securing France's core territories by extending borders to geographical barriers like seas, mountains, and rivers, using natural obstacles to deter potential aggression. Pursuing these natural boundaries, Napoleon initiated his aggressive wars. Kissinger highlights, seeking natural boundaries, from France's perspective was merely a defensive measure to protect its territory. However, in Napoleon's case, despite commanding a powerful land army, establishing geographical barriers placed other countries in an extremely insecure position. France's pursuit of absolute security meant absolute fear for its neighbors. This is where the mechanism of balance of power started operating. Ultimately, Napoleon faced defeat under the encirclement of the entire Europe. Through Napoleon's case as a negative example, Kissinger reveals several critical discoveries. Firstly, in international politics, a country with stronger hard power isn't always at an advantage. Diplomacy involves intricate psychological interactions. If a major power only prioritizes its security interests without considering other countries' sentiments, it's prone to triggering the balance of power mechanism, becoming a target of resentment. Additionally, in diplomatic activities, means sometimes outweigh ends. While Napoleon aimed to safeguard France's security, a reasonable demand, his blind faith in military might, even in handling economic disputes between France and Russia, resulted in war. In such cases, nobody cares about the reasonableness of France's objectives, the focus shifts to swiftly defeating this hegemony. However, Kissinger also states, though the balance of power can prevent the long-term existence of a hegemonic state, it falls short of achieving peace. As wars become common means in countering hegemonic nations, the cost is often colossal. Therefore, to minimize the use of force, balancing power alone isn't sufficient, it needs a consensus on values. This consensus, termed legitimacy by Kissinger, is the second cornerstone of his diplomatic doctrine. Balancing power restrains expansionist inclinations of major powers, while legitimacy diminishes their willingness to resort to warfare. This combination effectively eliminates threats to peace and allows international order to stably operate. Note, Kissinger uses legitimacy, not justice. This differs somewhat from our usual discussions about world peace. Our yearning for peace and opposition to war are generally due to the belief that peace is more just, right? Yet, Kissinger argues that justice is an abstract concept. Engaging in practical diplomatic activities stemming from abstract ideas leads to chaos. However, legitimacy is more specific, primarily involving established rules that are widely accepted. Moreover, after the fall of the Napoleonic Empire, monarchical countries in continental Europe decided to form an alliance to safeguard monarchical stability. Kissinger sees this alliance as an expression of legitimacy. Once a country acknowledges other countries' monarchs, initiating external wars for regime change becomes highly improbable. As the willingness to maintain the status quo strengthens, so does legitimacy, preserving peace. You'll notice that in Kissinger's perspective, peace is a state, not a goal. His two diplomatic doctrines focus on preventing wars rather than judging the justice of international order. From this viewpoint, Kissinger embodies a thorough realist. In the conclusion of A World Restored, he candidly states, those who commonly disrupt political order fall into two categories, conquerors and prophets. Conquerors use force to impose their views, while prophets pursue eternal, flawless peace. Politicians should be wary of these two types. In Kissinger's diplomatic doctrines, balancing power counters conquerors, while legitimacy denies the prophets. For him, diplomacy primarily is a maneuverable political art, not just an abstract idea. Later, when Kissinger was involved in diplomatic endeavors such as negotiating the Vietnam ceasefire and the thaw in Sino-American relations, he adopted this pragmatic attitude. Alright, those are the two principles Kissinger proposed in A World Restored to ensure long-term peace. However, diplomacy involves specific individuals. Whether principles work depends on politicians' operational skills. In the book, Kissinger vividly portrays the 19th-century diplomats Metternich and Castlereagh, who were instrumental in Europe enjoying prolonged peace after the Napoleonic Wars. Let's start with Metternich. Marx mentions this Austrian statesman in the first paragraph of the Communist Manifesto. Metternich abhorred the French Revolution and despised the emerging 19th-century nationalist movements and the bourgeoisie. Marx saw him as an antagonist. Yet, Metternich was an experienced diplomat, becoming an envoy at 21 and serving as Austria's foreign minister for 39 years. At that time, Europe's diplomats were mostly aristocrats skilled not in negotiations but in hosting banquets and balls. Metternich continued this tradition. Kissinger jests that he looked like a puppet from a Rococo painting, behaving romantically and frivolously. From a young age, Metternich traveled across Europe with his father, who served as an envoy, learning French, English, and Russian. The Austrian emperor valued his linguistic talents and social skills, sending him to Paris to establish relations with France. Surprisingly, Metternich developed an underground affair with Napoleon's sister, becoming a star in social circles. In 1809, through Metternich's matchmaking, Napoleon decided to marry Austrian Princess Marie-Louise. The Austrian emperor became the father-in-law of the French emperor, and naturally, hostilities eased. As a reward for Metternich's achievement, the Austrian emperor promoted him to foreign minister at the age of 36. This incident reveals that although Metternich was ideologically conservative, his political acumen was highly flexible. During Napoleon's zenith, Metternich went to great lengths to cozy up to him, avoiding offending France. However, when Napoleon faced defeat in Russia, Metternich immediately turned against him, joining the anti-French alliance. Kissinger lauds Metternich as a great tactician. By the autumn of 1814, when France's defeat was certain, and the victorious nations prepared to discuss a new European order, Austria surprisingly hosted the conference, with Metternich as its chairperson. This significant gathering was known as the Congress of Vienna. There's a familiar saying, weak countries have no diplomacy. No hard power, no say, a seemingly obvious principle. Among the victorious nations at the Congress of Vienna, Austria was that weak country. Its army and navy were only 28% and 86% of Russia's and Britain's, respectively, and its per capita industrial output was less than half of Britain's. Logically, such a weak nation's propositions should have been disregarded. However, Metternich broke this rule. He acted as a broker of the European order, proposing a negotiation framework beneficial to all countries, enveloping Austria's specific interests within it. At that time, Metternich said, if all countries can realize the danger of hegemony and organize themselves according to the principle of balance of power, then peace is assured, and Austria's interests won't be threatened. Here, the earlier mentioned balance of power emerged. It's on this issue that Metternich received another politician's response, the British Foreign Secretary Castlereagh. Unlike Metternich's adept social skills and amiability, Castlereagh was aloof, described by Kissinger as like a snow-covered high mountain, seldom trodden upon. In British politics, Castlereagh was a nonconformist because he advocated close ties with continental Europe, contradicting Britain's traditional policy of offshore balancing. As a maritime power, Britain's focus lay in its global trade empire and overseas colonies. In Europe, it had neither territory nor troops stationed. Britain's traditional foreign policy was to foster a few allies on the continent, relying on their strength to counter potential hegemonic states. Even in opposing Napoleon's wars, Britain primarily deployed its navy. It was unwilling to entangle itself in continental politics. However, Castlereagh opposed this path. He realized that with the Industrial Revolution and the increasing scale of warfare, the efficiency of offshore balancing had diminished. In 18th-century wars, mobilizing an army of 100,000 was a major power's limit. But in the Napoleonic Wars, France's total army strength exceeded 1 million, easily overpowering any traditional strong nation. If Britain continued staunchly with offshore balancing, intervening in European politics only after war outbreak, even if it eventually defeated the hegemonic state, the cost would be immense. Therefore, Britain needed to further integrate into Europe, establish close ties with major powers during peacetime, and adopt a united stance. Castlereagh's diplomatic ideology also revolved around the balance of power. Because Castlereagh and Metternich both adhered to balance of power, despite their dislike for each other, they cooperated tacitly during the 1814 Congress of Vienna. Their first joint decision was to invite representatives from defeated France to the conference and offer relatively lenient peace terms. France lost the territories annexed since 1795 but retained its pre-revolution boundaries and didn't pay reparations. Castlereagh explained that only by adopting a lenient policy towards France could they prevent future retaliation and the emergence of another Napoleon. After signing the treaty, France became part of Europe's new order, aligning with Britain and Austria to counter potential hegemonic countries like Russia. This ensured significant guarantees for European peace, allowing the balance of power principle to operate in a stable state. Metternich and Castlereagh made a second joint decision, to reshape the political landscape of Germany. Since the 17th century, the entire German region had been fragmented. There were over 300 German-speaking feudal principalities, each with minimal land and population, unable to resist invasion from any major power. Germany's weakness hindered the operation of the balance of power. To address this, with the support of Britain and Russia, Metternich devised a plan to reorganize the German order. The original 300-plus small states merged into 39 relatively larger states, with Austria at the helm. Each state, including Prussia, Austria's competitor, had to obey Austria's command during wartime. This consolidated Germany into a more concentrated military force yet remained politically decentralized enough not to raise suspicions from other countries, providing essential support for the operation of the balance of power. However, the balance of power didn't resolve all post-war European issues as a new player emerged at the negotiation table, Russia. Traditionally a peripheral player in European politics, Russia now possessed significant military might. If it expanded towards Western Europe, the disruption would surpass that of Napoleon's France. In addressing the Russian issue, Metternich employed what Kissinger referred to as the second diplomatic principle, legitimacy. Metternich noticed that Tsar Alexander I of Russia was a religious and political conservative, believing in divine right and opposing any form of revolution. Hence, Metternich persuaded the Tsar and the King of Prussia to form a political organization called the Holy Alliance. Ostensibly, the alliance aimed to uphold the legitimacy of monarchies and serve as a tool for three monarchy-led major powers to suppress bourgeois revolutions in Europe. However, it had a deeper purpose. By acknowledging the sacred inviolability of Austria and Prussia's monarch similar to the Tsar, Russia had no legitimate reason to invade these neighboring countries and threaten the safety of Europe's heartland. Consequently, when Russia engaged in European diplomacy, it had to consider Austria and Prussia's sentiments. Endowed with legitimacy, Austria ceased being a weak country with no diplomacy, and became a crucial player in European diplomacy. On the other hand, although Castlereagh was skeptical of the Holy Alliance, he also believed that Europe's political issues should be settled by the rulers of major powers. If countries maintained close ties and extensive communication in peacetime, it could prevent conflicts from escalating into wars. This communication mechanism was termed European concert. Under Castlereagh's proposal, the 5 countries, England, France, Russia, Austria, and Prussia, agreed to convene international conferences every 1 to 2 years starting from 1818, openly discussing all significant political issues in Europe. Although Britain withdrew from the 5 power meetings after Castlereagh's death in 1822, the practice of European concert continued. From the conclusion of the 1815 Vienna Congress, Europe witnessed nearly 30 years without major wars among great powers. It wasn't until the outbreak of World War I in 1914 that 3 or more major powers were simultaneously involved in a war. These were legacies of Metternich and Castlereagh's political endeavors. Well, that's about it for the main content of Kissinger's A World Restored. Although a historical study, Kissinger's perspective extends far beyond the 19th century described in the book. He opens by comparing several important peace efforts in history. The order forged by Metternich and Castlereagh seemed conservative, not very progressive in ideological terms. Yet, by faithfully practicing the diplomatic principles of balance of power and legitimacy, maintaining flexibility and restraint, it ensured nearly a century of overall peace. Conversely, after World War I, politicians at the time were focused on establishing the most just and perfect peace, immersed entirely in the pursuit of abstract principles, forgetting the logic of balance of power, leading swiftly to the outbreak of World War II. This perspective shows that international political issues always boil down to the practical game of power, where means often outweigh slogans. When Kissinger became a shaper of U.S. foreign policy, he started an attempt to unite China against the Soviet Union based on the balance of power principle, sparking a turning point in the history of the Cold War. Similarly, in today's world, a country that relentlessly pursues hegemony will sooner or later trigger the balance of power mechanism, facing resistance from the international community. In fact, for ordinary individuals like us, Kissinger's diplomatic principles are quite valuable. For instance, in business negotiations, we often strive for maximum gains, believing that toughness represents assertiveness. But Kissinger tells us that according to the principle of balance of power, being too forceful, excessively pursuing exclusive interests, will only provoke resentment from the other party. Making timely concessions, placing one's demands within common interests, is the way to sustain cooperation. Legitimacy, as a principle, can guide our interpersonal relationships. After all, shared values often transcend specific differences, making friendships more solid. That wraps up the essence of this book. Congratulations on finishing another book. Thank you all for your support and attention. Please subscribe to the Tim Booker channel, like, and share this valuable knowledge with your friends. Let's combine wisdom with practice, achieve our financial goals, and create a better future together. Thank you, goodbye.